The following program was produced by an independent community producer. The opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of the ECAT staff or board of directors.
Good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Megan. I'm the head of Reference and Adult Services at the Ames Free Library. And I thank you all for being here tonight. I would be remiss if I didn't start by saying thank you to the Friends of the Ames Free Library for their wonderful and generous, unwavering support of our mission to be where the community connects. This wonderful presentation that you're about to see tonight would not be possible without their sponsorship, so my hearty thanks to them for making this possible. For many of you, I suspect that tonight's speaker needs no introduction. Ted Reinstein has been a reporter with WCPB's Chronicles since 1995, and his work has brought him to every corner of New England and earned him countless accolades and awards, including an Emmy for his reporting on the Goodnight lights in Providence, Rhode Island. Beyond Chronicle, he has also worked with the Discovery Channel, HGTV, and the Travel Channel. Somehow, between all of that, he has also found the time to write and publish 5 books. We're thrilled to have him here tonight to discuss his latest book, Travels Through the Heart and Soul of New England. Please join me in giving Ted.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Megan. And thank you first to the Friends for having me here tonight. This is, I think it's my 3rd visit here to the Ames Free Library. How many of you have been to one of my previous talks? Oh, that's good. Not good enough, but no, it's a beautiful library. It's a legendary library. It's a beautiful library, both the Queeset House, but also the main library. That reading room, it's stunning, and you don't find many libraries like that anymore. So it's wonderful to be back here. Thank you all for coming out, and again to the Friends. I'm going to be talking to you tonight about my most recent book, which came out just under a year ago, last summer. And this book is it's really something of a labor of love. Every time I say that, though, I would say, like any book is. In fact, anything that any one of us does, whether it's writing a book or cooking a very special meal or creating a garden, it's all a labor of love, right? Anything that we put a lot of time and effort and love and passion into is a labor of love. But this in particular is something that I thought I might do, I don't know, later on, maybe even after I had stopped working at Chronicle, as kind of a little looking back. And then the opportunity came to do it with my publisher a few years ago, and so I decided to do it. And what makes it special in this case is that, as Megan alluded to, all my traveling around New England to every corner of New England over the past now almost 30 years, a lot of places that are very special to me. But this isn't about places. Obviously, things exist in a place, but this is about the most memorable people that I've met in all my decades of traveling and reporting around New England. And it isn't just that these folks, their stories appealed to me deeply to begin with, or I wouldn't have done them to start with, but the people became special to me. What makes this particularly unique and special is that all of the people are people that I have stayed in touch with. I have become, in many cases, actually really personal friends with. These are people that I don't just say, hey, they're a friend of mine. We met 12 years ago. I don't know what's going on with them. They're people who are really a part of my life in many ways. That isn't to say that I talk to them every day, but it is to say that Slim is gone, but everyone else here except Slim is someone that I have seen, interacted with in just over the last 2 years, and in some cases, a few months. So that doesn't always happen. It can't possibly happen. I've done hundreds and hundreds of stories over those almost 30 years for Chronicle, and you simply do not become friends with everyone you do a story with. Oftentimes, you can't wait for that story to be done. But not in this case. So let me jump in, and I think you'll see pretty quickly why some of these people and their stories are so special, so memorable, and have stayed with me. The full title of the book is Stories of Struggle, Resilience, and Triumph. So for the purposes of our talk over just under the next hour, I'm going to those three topics of struggle, resilience, and triumph, and separate the talk into that and give you an example of some stories that go along with that. If you are at all familiar with my reporting for Chronicle over these many years, you may know that I very, very frequently, almost invariably, will make a diner a part of my traveling. And the thing is, you know, who doesn't like diners? It's not me. It's not just me. But I always say, you know, that if I have the opportunity like now to actually talk about what the diners mean in terms of my traveling, it's not the food. It is not about the food. In fact, there's nothing that you can order. It's not like diners are like exotica. There's nothing, you can get pancakes anywhere. You know, there's nothing about a diner that you can't get somewhere else. So it's not about the food. I like good food as much as the next person, and I like a good diner breakfast as much as the next person, but it's not about the food. Any more so than you may also know that I love to stop in at local general stores. In fact, wrote a book about them in New England as well. But it's not about the stuff you find in a general store. There is nothing that you can find in a general store anywhere that you can't find somewhere else. In fact, you can probably find it on Amazon and pay less money. So if it's not about the food at the diner and it's not about what you can buy at a general store, then what is it? The irony, I always say, and I love to point out, the irony is it's about something that neither a diner or a general store sells, and yet it's offered for free. And beyond that, it's priceless. Because what they both offer, and the reason why I visit them so much and make them a part of my stories, they offer a community gathering place. They are places where communities gather. Can you buy what you can eat at a diner somewhere else? Of course you can. You can stop at exit blah, 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 and get a McBreakfast. Is there such a thing? There must be. Do they call it that? Who knows? Who cares? The point is, yes, you can get that somewhere else, but you won't get the sense of community. You can buy something you'll find on the shelf at a general store somewhere else and pay less money, but you won't get that sense of community. You certainly won't have the experience you're having here tonight, because I'm sure, although it's not true for me, but I'm sure that many of you in this room see familiar faces here, right? Megan alluded to that. So that's what makes community gathering places so special. And the reason why I've taken a moment to actually say all this is that not only will I be sharing a couple of my favorite diners with you tonight, but that's what all of these people have in common as well. No, they don't all own a diner. They don't all own a general store, but they do all share I'm sure our sense of just how precious community gathering places are. Like, by the way, public libraries, because that's also a place that often shows up in my stories. So for our first topic, struggle. So we'll get the hard part out of the way. No, struggle is hard. Struggle can be hard. And struggle can be about big things, and struggling can be about small things. It can be about a single life. It can be about many, many lives. In terms of Gloucester, Massachusetts, where I've done dozens of stories over the years, because I'm drawn to stories that are about underdogs, about people fighting back. And Gloucester represents all of that and more. And the struggle there is about something very, very big, right? The struggle in Gloucester is about trying to preserve an entire way of life, which of course is what? Fishing. Exactly. How is it doing? Well, not very well. You know, I don't need to go. We're in Massachusetts, right? I mean, we're on the water. If we were in Topeka, I might have to go into why it is that Gloucester, right? But we don't have to go into all the details. You know that the struggle in Gloucester is partly because the fish have become more scarce, and tied in with that is the bigger part of it, which is that 55 years ago, the federal government, in an effort to deal with the fact that the fish stocks were declining, instituted, right, all the rules and regulations that are still in place, by the way, to try to arrest the decline. What started with the cod fishery, but grew out to 12 or 13 other species. The idea being that if we didn't arrest the decline of the fishery, then it was all going to go away as a profession and a family way of life anyway. So if there's any way potentially of saving that, that might be the way to do it. Is it working? I don't know. I can't tell you. I can't tell you, and neither can the federal government because it's still going on. So I can't tell you if it's working. I can tell you, working or not, what it has meant to Gloucester. I can tell you in terms of numbers that maybe you don't know. So it was estimated that in and around 1900 technically, but that whole 20-year period, 1900 out to 1920, it's estimated there were about 2,500 family-owned fishing boats in Gloucester. It doesn't mean the 2,500 boats were out on the water every single day. It just means that there were about 2,500 family-owned fishing boats. And if you wonder why I'm saying family-owned fishing boats, because that's what most of them were. And that's what most of them are not today, which figures entirely with our story, right? So, the irony is that if you use the term family-owned fishing boat in 1920, somebody would say, what the hell kind of boat is there, right? The corporate boats that vastly outnumber the family-owned boats today in Gloucester. These are boats that are owned by often a consortium of investors. They may have multiple boats, even in multiple ports, but that wasn't the case then, right? So there were about 2,500. About 50 years later, right, so in the 70s, it was estimated that number was halved, right? So about 1,200 family-owned fishing boats. Those were estimates. 3 years ago, 2022, the census was taken again. This time it was definitive because it didn't take very long to do it. And that number was down to double digits, 79. So it's going away. There are those who think that in 10 years' time, that number will be down to single digits, and then it may be gone. Does that mean that nobody will be fishing? No, there will be people fishing, but this way of life, of family-owned fishing boats, may well be gone. And for folks like my friend Joe Sanfilippo, Captain Joe Sanfilippo, it's been devastating, right? So, as I said, the question of whether or not the cod fishery, the other fisheries have been, whether or not the fish stocks declining has in any way been arrested or slowed. I can't go down that rabbit hole. First of all, it's way over my pay grade. But second of all, it is not definitive. It is still going on. Here's what we know for certain, however, that one of the effects of the rules and regulations of the last 55 years is that it has driven people out of fishing, like the Sanfilippos. It has driven them out of fishing because, you know, if you have mouths to feed, if you have kids, if you have a mortgage to pay, you just, it's almost impossible to deal with it. The rules and regs are structured in such a way that they are fluid, they are not fixed, so you can't budget for it. There are what they call rolling closures of great fishing banks like Stellwagen and George's, where that will close down overnight. So if you're like someone like Joe, who described multiple times to me, you know, that he's got a boat that's all fitted out to head out to Stellwagen Bank on some given morning, you know, at 5 a.m., and he's baited up for haddock and groundfish, and his phone pings in the middle of the night at 2 o'clock in the morning, and he finds out Stellwagen is closed. He's not going out. But He still has to pay a crew of 3 people for the week. He has to dump $2,000 worth of bait into the harbor. And you can't, obviously, you can't budget for a family that way. And so it drove Joe out about 10 years ago. He considers himself fortunate that he still gets to work on the water. He's not fishing, but he is captaining the Beauport right there over his shoulder, which is a cruise boat that goes out of Gloucester Harbor. But here's what he does after his day of captaining the Beauport around Gloucester Harbor. So we said that, you know, struggle can be about something big, and there aren't a lot of bigger things than an entire way of life. You can do one of 3 things, to my way of thinking. If there's a fourth, I'm all ears. But to my way of thinking, there are really 3 responses, you know, to struggle for any of us, no matter what the struggle is. You can, the first thing you can do is something that I do quite frequently. I'm sure I'm not the only one, which is to kick the struggle down the road for a little bit. You can deny, you can ignore, so that's a time-honored response to struggle. You can be overwhelmed by a struggle, and there's no shame in that. There are brutal struggles that have overwhelmed good people, and there's no shame in that. Sometimes something is just too much, you know, too much of a cross to bear for a single person. But the third way, you can engage a struggle, and you can try to fight back. And that may also not be successful, as we well know, but it is a response to struggle. It is a third response to struggle. And that's what Joe Sanfilippo has done, because he's realized that he's not coming back to fishing. His family has basically been driven out of fishing. Fishing itself is not going away. And he wonders, but what if the rules and regs go away at some point? What if things do, for some reason, relax and more people financially are able to get back into commercial fishing, and there aren't enough people anymore who know how to fish commercially? You know, the only way you learn how to fish commercially is for someone to teach you how to do it. That's the only way. The only way. And I have spent some fun hours researching that that's true. For instance, millions and millions, multiple millions of book titles on Amazon. And in the entire series of that for dummies, there is not one book, Commercial Fishing for Dummies. There is not one college, not a community college, not saying nothing marine related. There are wonderful marine biology programs all around New England at many, many schools. There is not one single course at a single New England school, community college, whatever, Commercial Fishing 101. So the only way to learn is to basically be an apprentice and work with the commercial fish. That's how the entire Sanfilippo family and every family that fished in Gloucester, that's how they learn. That's how they learn. Joe learned to fish from his older brother Ricky. Ricky learned to fish from their dad. The dad learned to fish from their grandfather. Their grandfather learned to fish from their Sicilian great-grandfather, right? That's how it went. So the boats are going away. We established that dramatically, right? Boats can be replaced. Boats are a thing. They make them, they sell them, people resell them, they fix them up, they refloat them. You can get a boat. You can buy a boat. They're not cheap, but boats can be replaced. What can't be replaced, as Joe puts it, is that pipeline of fishing knowledge. That is drying up, and that cannot be replaced. So what does he do at the end of his day on the water? Ties up the Beauport. He walks about 2 blocks, and he walks up to the 2nd floor of a warehouse space that he rents, and he teaches people the fundamentals of commercial fishing. So there is somebody who's teaching commercial fishing, just not at a school, although I do call what he does night school for fishing. His students are men, they're women, they're old, they're young. They are people, for the most part, who have never fished commercially. None of them have a commercial fishing license. None of them own a commercial fishing boat. None of them are likely to be commercially fishing in the next year, maybe 2 years, maybe 5 years, maybe never. People for good reason, people Joe knows, people in Joe's family describe what he's doing as a waste of time, a waste of money, quixotic, idiotic. He's heard it all, and he's still doing it. So it may be all of those things, right? But to me, it's also inspiring as a response to struggle. His feeling is, you know what? I want to be able to say, I love fishing. I love what the legacy of fishing has meant for my city. I love what the legacy of fishing has meant for my family. And if it's ever possible for somebody to get back into fishing who would not be able to do it unless someone helped teach them like they taught me, I'm willing to be that person. And I really admire him for doing it. And I'm talking about the fundamentals of fishing, like mending a fishing net. The absolutely most fundamental thing. Joe Sanfilippo, every kid in Gloucester learned to mend fishing nets when they were literally first graders, literally 4, 5, 6 years old, because that's what they did. That's what you knew you were going to be doing on summer afternoons. You were going to be plopped down on a dock, right? You were going to be plopped down on the dock, and your dad or your uncle or your brothers or your grandfathers would have left mounds of fishing nets that need mending, and they would buy you a cold Coke, and you would mend the nets. And now he's teaching adults, and I love that. Now, sometimes struggle is not about great numbers of people. Sometimes struggle involves a single individual, right? And so this is a case of that. Sometimes the struggle, as any journalist will tell you, is about simply getting a good story out. Just getting a good story out that you think would be important, interesting for other people to know about. And you know that they don't know about it. And that's, by the way, that's not an easy thing to do if you're not connected with a media platform, okay? So I've always felt very fortunate that, my experience as a broadcast journalist has been in connection with a very deep-pocketed company, the Hearst Corporation. So there's never been any fear of whether or not we could actually get a story out. The worry is more about what you want it to be, which is what would be the best story we can get out. What's the best way to tell this story? But for somebody like Jerry August, not a journalist, not connected with any media platform whatsoever, how do you get a story out? You could try to interest a journalist in the story. What if you really want to share that story? What if it's personal for you or has become personal and you want to share that story? You want to somehow have control over how that story is shared, but you're not connected with the media platform. It doesn't happen. Now, she did make it happen because it was that good a story. But Jerry Ann Boggess is an extraordinary woman. She is, first of all, the embodiment of the immigrant experience in America. She really is, which, of course, needless to say, is all of our experience. Hers may be, I don't know, hers may be a little more recent than folks here tonight. She emigrated from Jamaica in the early 1970s. She brought up a couple of wonderful kids in New Hampshire, went on to college in New Hampshire. She herself found herself settling initially in the little town of Milford, New Hampshire. I don't know if you know where that is. It is in very, very southern New Hampshire. It is about 12 miles west of Nashua, so it's very southern. Lovely little town, former mill town, and she found herself settling there, and she loved it. She had an image in her head that was some mix between Currier and Ives and something else, and she found it in Milford. She loved it. One of her first impressions, however, beyond the fact that it was this lovely little New England town, was that she noticed that there was not, as it turns out, a single other person in Milford, New Hampshire, in the early 1970s who looked like her. And she wasn't put off by that. She's not put off by much, trust me. She's seen worse and dealt with worse. But she thought, okay, well, this is interesting. So what she did was, which I love, she made that part of a project that she wanted to create for herself, right? First of all, she could have been a wonderful journalist. I've always told her that. She could have been a wonderful journalist. She has all the tools. She has a tremendous sense, which is tool number one, I think. But she has a tremendous sense of curiosity. You plop her in a room, and like me, she will look around. She will get down on her hands and knees, and what's this, and what does this connect to, and how old is this building? And so that she is a tremendous researcher. She has a tremendous work ethic. She is tireless. She is funny. She will talk to anybody. She will ask anybody anything. She is never, ever tired of asking questions. which I can attest to after sharing a 3.5 drive with her, 3.5 hour drive. But anyway, she was not a journalist. Nonetheless, she set a project for herself when she moved there. She said, okay, you know what? So I'm looking for a project. She wanted to do something that would allow her to, do some research about her new community, her new town, her new home. It would get her to be more acclimated to her new town, her new state, her new country. And so she decided she wanted to do a project like this, and then she said, I know what the project will be now. When she realized that there was no one else who looked like her, she said, you know what? I'm going to research and see if there was ever anyone in Milford's whole history who lived here, who looks like me. And that's what she set herself to doing. And she made a historic find. Was this a find in the sense that no one knew of this person? No, there were folks locally who knew of this person. But this person actually had a historic story attached to their life. That was not well known. And it brought historians and journalists to Milford. So I'm going to share that with you. But first, she didn't stop at that. She didn't stop at that, right? She said, she made this find and she said, wow, I wonder if there are other stories like this all around this entire state where there are not, in general, a lot of people who look like me. And that's true for the whole state. And she started doing these research projects all over the state, drilling down all over, researching for years, talking to people, going through records, word of mouth, oral histories. And what she did became the basis of what she does and what she created, because she became ultimately, because they had found so many pockets of African American history in this whitest of states, literally, that's a fact, that she became the co-creator and co-founder of the wonderful Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire. Today she's the executive director, and so she has found places like that where there are stories that people would be surprised about, as I was when she led me around Portsmouth Harbor one morning a few years ago, beautiful October morning, and pointed out to me that there had been slave auctions in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, which is pretty far north of Biloxi, Mississippi, in the 1850s, right? And so that was surprising to me, and it is surprising to people every day when they walk that trail. But like a bad journalist, I buried the lead. So what was the pioneering find she made in her town of Milford, New Hampshire? Harriet E. Wilson. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Harriet E. Wilson. I'm just going to move that little cursor there that's underneath, because you know what happens? If you don't move it, ultimately it ends up right in somebody's nostril. And then, we all have a good laugh, but, it's not supposed to happen. So Harriet E. Wilson, unlike Jerry Ann Boggess, Harriet E. Wilson was born in Milford, New Hampshire. Unlike Jerry Ann, Harriet E. Wilson was a native daughter of Milford, New Hampshire. Also, unlike Jerry Ann Boggess, Harriet E. Wilson had a childhood that reads like something out of Charles Dickens. She was born to a very, very struggling young black couple. They simply could not afford another mouth to feed. They swaddled this young girl into blankets, put her in a big wicker basket, and left her on the front porch of a wealthy white family in Milford. Fortunately, the family took her in, which was good. She became the family's indentured servant. For most of her growing up years, she was a brilliant young woman. Learned to read and write by the time she was 6 years old. She taught other children, all of that family, hers and other children all around Milford, reading and writing. She was a voracious reader. She kept journals. She was a wonderful writer. And in 1859, Harriet E. Wilson became the first black author to have a novel published in North America. So that was a pioneering event. She is actually buried here in Massachusetts and not that far from here. She's buried in Quincy, believe it or not. Believe it or not. And owing to Jerry Ann Boggess's indomitable spirit and energy, in 2006, Jerry Ann succeeded in persuading her adopted town of Milford to memorialize their native daughter, Harriet E. Wilson. So, our first diner. Anybody ever been to the Windsor? In Windsor, Vermont? No? Wonderful, authentic diner. It's a you know what a Worcester dining car diner, right? So that's the original of the originals. I don't remember its badge number, but it's right there as you walk in. Very unique diner, very authentic, very unique. Teresa Rhodes, a very unique owner. First of all, bit of a rarity of rarities. For one thing, she is a woman who owns her own diner without there having been any man involved. It's mostly men who own diners. What else is new? But it is rare in this case that she did not inherit it. She didn't have a father or husband who died. It wasn't shared with a brother, which is often the case in many other diners. So she owned it outright from the beginning and still does. But that's not unprecedented. I know some other women who own diners. But what makes this a rarity of rarities is something I've never encountered. I don't expect to see it again. She runs the diner solo. Wow. Yeah, wow. So you will look in vain for anybody running around taking orders, helping cook the food, serve the food. She's doing everything. I've never seen anything like it, and I have been in hundreds of diners. When she first described it to me on the phone, I thought I was missing something. Maybe she meant that I thought, because I figured just rationally, I don't know how a person can do that and be able to make it work. She will allow that on a very, very busy fall weekend, leaf peeping season, when buses roll up, she will have a couple of kids from the high school come and help her out. But on most mornings, like this morning, and I was in there, all by herself. So I had a seat when I came in at one of those stools on this side of the counter, right? This side of the counter here, and I'm going to get to Billy in a moment, but this side of the counter here was filled with people. 3 of the 4 booths that are over here by the windows were filled. And I'm watching her, and I'm like, this is insane. And I'm like, it's got to be a trick. So I swear to God, I spent the first 10 minutes studying her up and down, to allow for whether or not there was she had an extra appendage. She didn't. She's like 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 hands, 5 fingers on each hand. Okay, so that wasn't it. So at one point, I said, this is ridiculous. I said, what am I missing? Because it wasn't devolving into chaos. I mean, it was getting done. It was busy. It was getting done. And I said at one point, I said, Teresa, I said, listen, I know you don't even have to look at me, but if you can entertain this question just while you're working, what am I missing? I said, I can't believe it. I said, it's not chaos in here. It's getting done. Now, granted, people had to, if somebody needed a menu, they were coming up to her to get one. So it wasn't like, a tremendous amount of running around. But I said, what am I missing? What's the trick? What's the trick? So she was working here, right? And so her back was to me. And she said, I said, what's the trick? And she stepped aside for a moment. And she went like that. And then she went back into place. And as she had moved away, I looked down at the black Rubbermaid mat where she had stood away for a moment. There were 2 white footprints painted on the Rubbermaid mat. So what she was telling me, and what I now understood, was the trick is she had found the optimum spot where she could stand, then arrange everything based on the fact that she would not be moving from that spot. So she was right in front of the grill. Everything was within arm's reach. The menus, the napkins, the utensils, the cash register, the coffee machine, the mugs. Everything she would need was within arm's reach. So I'm studying this, and I said, well, Teresa, what about if you have to serve somebody? So she said, watch. She just finished plating a guy's omelet. She got the home fries on there. She got the hash on there. She whipped around and she yelled out, arms up. Everybody at the counter sat back and went like this. Like a Frisbee. Like something out of a Bugs Bunny cartoon. Like something you think you'd see in a movie or a cartoon, but it was happening in real life. I said, she's not doing that. right along the counter. Now, I figured the guy was a regular who was receiving the omelet because he seemed to know how to receive a moving plate of food, which is that you do not get your fingers involved. You just sort of receive it like a goalie's glove pad. You know, you just like stop it, and then you deal with it. And she told me she sprays the counter with Pam. Okay? So it was also my good fortune that morning, though, to meet a longtime customer, Billy Nye. Billy, what a character. So Billy was about 83, so he's probably over 85, because this would have been about 3 years ago. He had just recently moved back to Windsor to live with his older daughter and her family. He was doing some house painting. He had been a customer, well, not a paying customer, because he was a little kid, but when he was a little boy, was in the diner every single day because his mom was a server at the diner. And he told me that every single day after school, he'd come to the diner, he'd put his book bag down right here, he'd sit on that stool right there, that stool that he's not sitting in, so this is important. So he'd sit in that stool right there, he'd start his homework, and his mom would check out his homework every so often as she walked by to get coffee or bring something out. And he said she would walk by, she'd be like, that's 14. And then it was I love the details that he was remembering. And she would bring him a glass of milk and a slice of pie while he did his homework. And he's telling me all this. I said, wait. At a certain point, I said, Billy, so I'm standing like right where I'm standing on the floor, right? And that stool is between us. And I said, Billy, how come you're not sitting in your stool, right? That is your stool. You have just described for me your stool. If this diner goes away overnight, they got to yank that stool up, bronze it with a plaque, and stick it out on the sidewalk with your name on it. That's your stool. How come you're not sitting in it? And he said, he said, that's a good question. So let me tell you. He said, the day I moved back here, he said, my daughter picked me up at Logan. We drove back up to Windsor, and I put my bags down at her house. And the first thing I did, I told her, I got to go check out the diner. She'd already told him that thankfully it was open, but he wanted to check it out. He said, as soon as I got there, I put my bags down. He said, my daughter was like, Dad, the diner's not going anywhere. He said, yeah, well, but I could be, so I got to go check it out. So he went and he walked down the street, and he saw somebody walking in and out. He was so happy to see that it was still busy. And he said he opened the door and he walked in, and his stool was sitting right there, and nobody was sitting in it. And he said he just started walking up to the stool, and he was going to sit. And then he said, a little voice in me said, Billy, it's been a long time. Maybe it's time you graduate to the next stool. And who can argue with that kind of reasoning, right? So resilience, our second topic, resilience. You know, I always think that there is something in the New England DNA that speaks to resilience. I really do. It's not like that everywhere, right? The weather alone, right? I mean, you do not have to be weather resilient for 1 minute in San Diego, okay? But you do in New England, especially this time of year. And by this time of year, I mean March through May, because right now it feels like March, right? So that period of spring in New England, right? Where you don't even know how many jackets to bring or what jacket to bring. You leave your house in the morning, there's snow on the ground, you know, it's 65, you know, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you bring 5 jackets, your bathing suit. I mean, it's crazy, right? So the weather alone speaks, I think, to a certain sense of resilience. There is another example of resilience, though, that I love, that I made part of this talk, and it's the only example of something in these chapters about struggle, resilience, and triumph that is not a person. There is a person attached to it. Needless to say, there's always a person. But this is the only time I include an object, something that is not a person, that really speaks to this quality. Because, and maybe you agree, I often think that New England's mill towns, right? And we are in an area right now, right? That's New England's mill towns and cities really speak to that sense of resilience. Because the mills, they're still there. They're still there. And they shouldn't be, because there was a long, long time where they had nothing to do. And there are lots of people in New England cities from, the Blackstone Valley all the way up to northern Maine where they would have loved to have gotten rid of those abandoned mills that had nothing to do and weren't offering a dime of revenue to the towns because that period had long passed, right? And they were still there. Now, part of that is because they were not made to be torn down. Okay, in many of these cities and towns, if I had a nickel for every time somebody has told me from Lewiston to Haverhill to Woonsocket to Pawtucket to you name it, where someone connected with the town, a mayor, anybody who was in position of some budgetary authority who has said some version of, if I could have blown that expletive deleted thing up and got away with it, I would have, right? You couldn't get rid of these things. And thankfully, many of those same people now would say to you, and thank God we didn't, because it figured in the resurgence of places like Biddeford, which I'll tell you about as an example from many of these places, because the thing is, New England's mill towns, the mills, all over New England, the thing is, no matter what they produced, whether it was millinery, whether it was blankets, whether it was men's shirts, women's textile, it didn't matter, leather goods, shoes, hats. The irony is that the same story, the same basic history is shared by every single mill. It's amazing that way. Because they all start in the, generally speaking, at some point, the earliest would be at some point in the 18th century, right, 1700s. They all reach peak prosperity at some point in the 19th century. And by peak prosperity, I don't have to tell you, a place like Haverhill was the shoe capital of the world. At one point, they were producing more shoes than any other city in the entire world. Not in like the Middle Ages, in the 19th century, right? And then all of these mills, including in Haverhill, went bust. At some point in the 20th century, some ghosted it out and lasted. Some were able to keep going. There were couple of blanket mills that are very famous in Lewiston that kept themselves going, Lewiston and Monmouth that kept themselves going and are still going. But for the most part, by the 1960s, 70s, they're gone. They're gone. And they're gone not because people suddenly didn't want to wear shoes, right? It's not people suddenly didn't need blankets. No. They were all gone because of greed, because the mill owners decided that they would seek out cheaper wages, right? First in the American South, and then they ditched the South and they went overseas. And so all of the mills shut down. The other part of the mill story that's crushing for all of these mill towns, and again, I'm sure I don't have to tell you folks, we're talking about in this area plenty of mills, but the thing that's often forgotten is that we think how crushing it was. There were mill towns like Biddeford, and Biddeford wasn't alone. 100% employment. That means they had X number of jobs. Every job was filled. As soon as a job wasn't filled, there was someone ready to fill it. 100% unemployment. Okay? By the 1980s in Biddeford, you had the unemployment rate inching up toward 30%. That's 5% higher than the Great Depression. Okay? So what's often forgotten is that it wasn't just the prosperity, it wasn't just the jobs that devastated these communities. It wasn't just that the jobs left, right? So they were no longer employing people, which is crucial for a local economy, wherever you are, right? It wasn't just the jobs left. It wasn't just that they were no longer paying any tax revenue, right? Even when they were empty, even when they were abandoned, they cost these cities and towns money because instead they were no longer places of employment, but they were places of arson and crime, drugs, and you needed to detail police to patrol them 24/7, and that cost money. Money that places like Biddeford did not have, right? So same story everywhere. But by the 1990s, thankfully, it changed. I always say that it's almost like a case in the 90s, which ironically is when the term perfect storm was born, for a bad thing, but it's almost like a perfect positive storm, right? Because the national economy turned in a way that suddenly did allow, once again, interest rates had lowered, and it was possible once again for large-scale development to happen. Where the mills come in, though, is that it's uncanny that it was also the birth time of when a lot of new businesses, new industries really, like biotech, really came into being. And what's interesting is that it's almost like things like biotech were designed to need large square footage like a mill. And they were all empty. And they were all there, and they were all able to be reinvented and reimagined and reemerge in places like Biddeford and everywhere else. In Biddeford, the story was so dramatic that the Renaissance in Biddeford, many people in Maine refer to as the Biddissance. And they credit Alan Cassavant, rightfully so, with being the right person at the right time, and boy, was he ever. Although there's nothing about Alan's personal story that really would have suggested that he would be someone who would preside over the city coming back. Not that he wasn't familiar with the city, he certainly was. 5 generations, French-Canadian family, the Cassavants in Biddeford. Alan was the first in the family, the entire 4 generations, to go to college. Nonetheless, just like all of his forebears, he worked in the mill. He worked in the mills every summer vacation in high school. He even worked in the mills when he was on college vacation. When he finished college, he came back to Biddeford. He was in Maine, but he came back to Biddeford, taught at school, was a math teacher, track coach. So where does that come in terms of saving the city? He's not a wealthy guy by any means. He's not a businessman. But Alan Cassavant is one of those people, and you can peg them in all of these places where there have been some great comebacks, like Lewiston, like Haverhill, like Lowell and Lawrence. It's not often just one person. In Biddeford, it wasn't one person either, but Alan really predominated in terms of how crucial he was. But again, not because he had money, because Alan Cassavant is one of those rare people that, first of all, people trusted him that he would have the best interests of the city at heart, because he loved that city. His family goes back more than 150 years in Biddeford. And he was somebody who wanted to give something back in any way he could, which is why he was a guidance counselor and a track coach. But he was eventually persuaded to run for mayor. And he did. And he became the longest serving mayor in Biddeford's history. 3 terms. He just retired 2 years ago. Never ever considered himself a politician. And in many ways doesn't seem like one. He's a rather shy, geeky kind of guy. He loves numbers. He was a math teacher, right? And yet he's that kind of person who can preside over a room full of people who have entirely different competing interests and get everybody to row in the same direction. Get everybody to give up a little something, gain a little something. Let's get another pizza. We're very close. And people love that about him. And so he presided over Biddeford coming back. It's an amazing story. The mills are almost completely fully occupied today. And it's not just biotech. There is biotech. There are other businesses. But it's that wonderful mix of commercial and residential, which is very, very often what you find now. Lot of businesses, but at the same time, there are mom and pop businesses. There's a wonderful little, there's a knapsack maker in there, I noticed one time, that's craft making these bags, There are breweries, 2 great breweries. There are restaurants and coffee shops. There's a wonderful mill history museum, and there are condos and apartments and some low-income housing. So all of that is making the mill buildings bustle once again. But there were 2 pieces of property in Biddeford that Alan felt very personally involved with. He felt like he had to get involved with somehow finding some way for somebody to buy these 2 pieces of property. Not because he had any connection to them, but he knew that both the City Theater and the Palace Diner were 2 long-time community gathering places in Biddeford. And Alan Cassavant is all about finding ways for the community to gather. And he knew that these places had been closed down. And he knew that if we could find a way to reopen them, he knew what that would mean for the morale boost for his city. And so he really got involved personally in trying to make that happen. He succeeded first at the City Theater. The City Theater is wonderful. It's like some buildings right here in Northeastern, which is that these are a municipal buildings. You'll find them in almost every old New England town. They're oftentimes, they may be wood, they may be brick, but they are all built sometime around the late 1800s, early 1900s, right? Sometimes by people like Richardson. The library's a Richardson project, right? I thought so. Yeah. So they always, like the libraries, had a municipal function entirely. They weren't built for private use. They were built for community use. They could be a library. They might house the town hall, the town clerk, and they would always have a community space attached to them. It might be a lecture hall. It might be used for dancing. Charles Dickens lectured at the City Theater in Biddeford, Maine in the 1840s, right? But in Biddeford's case, which is not the case here, in Biddeford's case, there was a long, slow decline. Why? As we've already said, because the economy went to hell in Biddeford, and there was no way they were able to keep up some of these buildings, right? But they did manage to find, just like libraries need great friends of the library, Alan Cassavan understood that, created the Friends of the City Theater, public-private partnerships, right, crucial, and they were able to fully restore the magnificence of the City Theater. The reason why I had my friend Tim Sample join me, Tim is a wonderful humorist. Maybe you've heard of him. Tim Sample is a wonderful humorist out of Maine, but in his early wastrel years, as he puts it, he fronted a rock band called the Dubious Brothers. You see, if you laugh at that, you're dating yourself and me, right? So I said that once, and usually I ride right over it, and I said, the Dubious Brothers, and he'll look at me like, I don't get it. Because I was talking to fifth graders. So I might as well said that I heard Tchaikovsky, play here. But anyway, the reason I had him meet me there, I knew that he had been the last band to play the City Theater. Because in its final years, in the death throes, when it was being condemned, that's what they were doing. They were having rock concerts at the City Theater. I knew his band was the last band to play the City Theater. So I know exactly what he's saying right there. I know exactly what he's saying because I said, what do you remember about that last gig? He said, I'll tell you what I remember. He said, that wall right there, he said, you could see the wallpaper rolling down if you look really closely. But he said, what we realized? Once we had started playing, and once we got people up on their feet and dancing in the aisles, you could see it literally rolling down the wall. Literally rolling down the wall. And less than a year later, they didn't have to worry about the wallpaper anymore because they condemned the theater, and they blew out the back wall, and they put in a couple of big garage, industrial garage doors. And on the lecture floor where once Charles Dickens lectured, the city DPW was storing mounds of road salt. Okay? But not anymore, because now it has been restored. He couldn't get over it. He said, he was like, they would have never let us play here. Now. The Palace Diner was the other one that Alan managed to bring back. And this was almost more important to him in some ways than the City Theater, only because you may or may not go to a lecture at the City Theater. You may or may not go to a rock concert at the City Theater, but everybody went to the Palace Diner. This was a block from the mills. The mill workers went there. The city hall workers went there. The mayor went there. Everybody gathered at the Palace Diner, and then it was closed, and it was crushing. And he would give anything to reopen it, but how? They could not find a buyer. It wasn't like they weren't trying. They were offering all kinds of incentives. They still weren't finding a buyer. Enter the two most unlikely buyers they possibly could have found. Well, first of all, because these guys had no intention of buying this diner, no matter how much they liked diners. And they did. They liked diners. But the fact is that Greg Mitchell and Chad Conley were superstar chefs in Portland, Maine. And Portland, as you may know, has become a serious food mecca, okay? These guys were superstar chefs. They weren't even 30, and places were bidding on getting these guys to come work for them, right? So they were like, we want to open our own restaurant. Who can blame them, right? Problem. They didn't have almost $1 million, which is what they found out they were going to need, not to open a restaurant, to enter into to be taken seriously by the city, so that the city would talk with them. They were going to need almost $1 million. So that wasn't going to happen. So they said, we're going to have to look somewhere else. And then somebody told them about the diner in Biddeford. And maybe, you should look at the diner. And they were like, we love diners as much as the next guy, but that's just not our thing. It's not our stick. We're not diner chefs. God bless them. Maybe we couldn't do it if we wanted to. I don't know, but we're not diner chefs, you know. We're like, you know, a different kind of cuisine. And they were honest about that. It wasn't a knock on diners, right? It wasn't a knock on diners. It wasn't their medium. It wasn't their milieu, if you'll pronounce. Let me use a fancy French word. They were like, so, you know, it's not our thing. And they're right about that, you know. No one in the history of diners has ever stopped at a diner anywhere on the face of the earth to see what they're doing with their trout au mondine, okay? So they understood that. Now, my theory is I never quite got this clear with these guys, but my guess is I know that it was a bleak winter day. It was a Saturday. They probably weren't doing anything. They weren't going to look at any other restaurant spaces. So somehow they were prevailed on by a friend to come and look. Just look. Just look. It's less than an hour. It's 25 minutes, guys. We'll drive down. Okay, fine. Okay. Word got out to our friend Alan Cassavant that 2 foodie chefs out of Portland were coming down to look at the Palace Diner. And his first words to the person who told him that were, "What are you talking about? They know it's a diner, right?" So Alan understood too. On the other hand, once he ascertained that these guys were actually coming to look at it, he was going to pull out all the stops. Okay? So he made sure they were faxed a list of all the incentives, all the things that the city were prepared to do, right, to sweeten the deal, and then he sweetened it further. So as mayor, he was able to requisition a couple of school buses, which he did. And he was able to twist a few, persuade some volunteers to fill the buses. And he was able to have some signs made up, all the same signs for all the volunteers on all the buses. And so you got to imagine, this is a Saturday daytime, right? So where's that picture of the diner? So it would have been daytime, light, right? So these guys are inside the diner. They're looking out the window here. And there's like a big parking area right here. And it would have been daytime. So they would have seen 2 school buses roll up. I'm sure, first of all, they wondered, what the hell, a couple school buses? It's a Saturday. And lo and behold, the doors open, and adults are getting off the school bus. And they all seem to be holding a sign. And then they all spread out, and they all hold up the exact same sign. And every sign said the exact same thing. "Dear Chad and Greg, please, for the love of God, buy me." And they did. Anybody ever been to the Palace? Anybody ever been? Best diner food I have ever tasted in my life. I am not kidding. And that has to do with the fact that these guys are amazing chefs. If you ever go and you eat there, you know, so occasionally I love it when someone's been there, because I say, do we know each other? No, we don't know each other. How is the food? And they will say invariably, unbelievable. Because I can't even describe. So you take 2 superstar chefs that are now doing diner food, and they get it. These guys totally get it. You make diner food. That's what people are coming in for. They're coming in for pancakes. They're coming in for French toast. They're coming in for Reuben. That's why they're coming in. We're not going to vary from that. We're not stupid. But we love to experiment with food. So they do subtle things. It's really hard to describe. They do subtle things with all those mundane things, and it's amazing. It's amazing. I shouldn't keep going because I haven't had dinner yet. So sometimes, when it comes to resilience, sometimes you find resilience in places you don't expect to find it. Like a humble little ski hill in Vermont, right? Now, it shouldn't surprise you to find a ski hill in Vermont, right? Because there's plenty of skiing in Vermont. It's one of the things Vermont is famous for. The reason why it's surprising here, anybody familiar with this area? That's usually not the case. No, it's really out of the way. East Corinth, Vermont is in the little southwestern tip of Orange County, Vermont, which is in kind of north central Vermont, over toward the Connecticut River, over toward the New Hampshire side, right? Orange County, Vermont, I always say there's 3 Orange counties in America. Orange County, Vermont is the only one that does not have palm trees and does not have money. It's a very poor area, and that's why you might be surprised to see a ski hill. We said that Vermont is very famous for skiing. It is. Skiing, maple syrup, what have you. I love Vermont. I want to say this in advance. I love Vermont. My children learned to ski in Vermont. I love Vermont. But and it is often associated with a certain degree of affluence. Places like Stowe, Killington, Stratton, you name it. These are places that really are legitimately moneyed places. Doesn't take anything away from them, but that's true. That's true. What's less well known about Vermont, and something that I've often tried to, I almost invariably go to places that really express that, because it's much less well known. Vermont is also a place where there are pockets of really crushing poverty. And when I say crushing poverty, I don't mean just, it's tough to afford a ski lift ticket. I mean it's tough to put 7 meals in front of your kids 7 days a week. That kind of poverty. I'm talking about poverty in places of Vermont that is on a scale with Appalachia. I had a woman tell me one time that her goal for the week in terms of feeding her family was, and bear in mind there are 7 days in a week, that her goal was to have at least one hot meal 5 days a week. Okay? So again, you would be surprised then to find a ski area, because skiing has become very expensive. How many of you ski, have skied? Okay, so it's very expensive. Even if you don't ski, it's expensive, because as a matter of fact, a poll about 7-8 years ago by Ski Magazine found that 88% of Americans not only don't ski, but actually would ski if it was affordable. It's not. It's not. There was a ski area out in Colorado, I forget the name now, but it's just as well, because I just want to spit out the side of my mouth when I think about it, that broke the $300 a day mark for a lift ticket. That's like diamonds, in the sense that, by the way, that's not an expensive lift ticket, that's an obscenity. Because it's like diamonds, right? The worth of a diamond is dictated by the market. The diamond has no intrinsic value, neither does paper money, for that matter, right? So the same is true of a lift ticket, of a ski lift ticket. So that area knows that we're going to push the bounds of what we can get. And that's indeed what they've done. And by the way, the ski industry, I love to ski. I love to ski. I don't ski as much, obviously, as I used to. But I started skiing as a little kid. It is one of the joys of my life. Love to ski. I feel very lucky that I've been able to pass along that love for skiing to my 2 daughters. I hate the ski industry because, and I'm not going to go down this rabbit hole. I'm going to end it right here because I could. You want to read something interesting sometime. Treat yourself. Well, that's not really treating yourself. Torture yourself. If you want to Google why is skiing so expensive, that is a choice. That is an absolute choice. It does not cost $300 a day to run a ski area, right? That is a choice that the ski industry made about 45 years ago. A choice that they made, and damn them, but they did, right? So why is there a ski hill? Why is there a ski hill in this little corner of one of the poorest counties in Vermont? Well, for starters, they didn't just build it. The ski hill has been there since the 1930s, when the community was a little bit different. The demographics were a little bit different, but nonetheless, the ski hill was there since the 1930s. In fact, that rope tow is today the longest continuously operating ground lift in North America. So the ski hill's been there a long time. Then it closed. During the 80s, the slump in the 80s, everything seemed to be closing, right? That's when the diner closed, and that's when, right? So they closed. It was too expensive to run. So it closed. Fast forward about 20 years, and a group gets together in the community, and they want to talk about reopening Northeast Slopes, reopening the ski hill, right? Problem. These people were not insensitive, and they were not unaware. Okay, it wasn't like some group came in, some company wanted to come in. That's not it. The community wanted to do this. And they were very aware that a lot of people will simply not be able to afford to ski now, given how the community makeup is today. So you can imagine, in a room probably like this, well, maybe not this beautiful, no. But, a lot of going back and forth, round and around and around. How are we going to do this? How are we going to price this? How are we going to make this work financially? We'll have a sliding scale. We'll be pay what you can. We'll have to, get loan. We'll get some grants. We'll blah, 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 blah. Then the Pearson family piped up. At that time, it would have been Wade's dad. It would have been Wade's dad who piped up first. But as he put it, I've been listening to all these ideas here for a few weeks about what we should price ourselves and how we should price a lift ticket. He said, but you got it all wrong. He said, I'll tell you how we price it, and then I'm happy to tell you how I think we should make that happen. And if that doesn't work out, then I'm out of here, because nothing but this is something that I can be part of. And they said, okay, Stu, well, how should we price a lift ticket? $0. We charge nothing. They went, how is that going to work? Well, I'll tell you. And he did. He'd done his homework, and indeed, that did carry the day. And today, Little Northeast Slopes is one of just 3 ski areas in America that is a non-profit. Non-profit, which, by the way, is my favorite oxymoron of all time. Forget jumbo shrimp. Non-profit ski area is my favorite oxymoron, right? So that's what they did. That's what they did. It is non-profit. It is 100% volunteers. Nobody makes a dime. They have fundraisers. They charge whatever you can afford. You don't pay. You can't pay. You don't pay. Because let's face it, it isn't just a lift ticket. It's also ski equipment, which is actually a lot more expensive than a lift ticket, right? And if you've got 2 or 3 kids and you can't spend $5 even on a lift ticket, you're not spending $1,500 on even used ski equipment, so you don't have to, because they also instituted the wonderful, I love it, the ski library, right? So it is a refurbished school bus that the Pearsons donated and refurbished, and it is filled to the gills every year with donated equipment from ski shops all over Vermont. And the wonderful thing is, and by the way, if you're not paying, this was very important for them. There's no stigma. No one knows who's paying and who isn't paying. There's no stigma whatsoever. And by the way, you are asked to pay what you can afford, and it's made very clear, and you also don't have to pay a dime. And have a great day. But if you can, I have been there. I'd heard about this. My last trip there, just back in January, I got actually to see this. Wade was dealing with this guy. He said, come here, come here. And a guy was sliding across the counter, so he asked, how much is the lift ticket today if I want to pay? And he was told, you know, what it was. It was like under $20, right? And he said, okay. And he said, will you accept a check? And they knew where this was going. And he said, yeah. And the guy slid across a check for $500. And that happens every day at Northeast Slopes, which is also how they stay in business. So my first time up there was in 2019, and I was so happy to meet Wade that day, because he was on the hill. He was like chief cook and bottle washer at that time, and he was presiding over the rope tow, which was great because I was planning to take the rope tow. I brought my skis with me because it's a wonderful little hill. How many of you have ever ridden a rope tow and lived to tell about it? You still have PTSD? Right, yeah. It is not fun to ride a rope tow, right? I mean, it can be enjoyable to sit in a chairlift, right? You sit in the chair, you have a nice view, blah, blah, blah. A rope tow makes you earn your way up the hill, right? Which you shouldn't have to do if you're already paying for a lift, but it does, right? To make matters worse, this rope was going faster than anything I've ever seen move. It was going so fast. It was, you know, it's like a big 5-inch diameter piece of rough hemp, you know? And it's going through the snow so fast, the friction had created like a foot-deep gully that it was in. So on top of everything else, I'm like, what am I supposed to fish this out with? My teeth? So I said, wait, what is going on with this thing? I've never seen something move this fast. I mean, do you slow it down for people? He said, no. He said, that's the charm of it. Charm? I said, what do you have running this thing? What do you have, a Pratt & Whitney jet engine inside that shed? He said, no, but it's a wonderful engine. Come and see. And indeed, in the true Vermont tradition of reusing, recycling, repurposing, they have repurposed Wade's high school 73 Dodge Dart with a slant 6, in which he told me he proposed to his wife. That runs the lift. So I've buried the lead once again. So we're talking about how expensive skiing is. It was a wonderful day, and you might be wondering how much I paid. I didn't break 20 bucks. $16.50. I insisted on paying the $10.50 for the half-day lift ticket. Then I spent another $6 on a delicious nor'easter burger, literally one of the most delicious hamburgers I've ever had, which is funny because it was made on one of those little camping Coleman stoves inside their rustic lodge. I would say it's a little smaller than this room, and what makes it unique, it's a little bit like having lunch in a moving subway car. Because you can't sit down, there's no chairs and tables because the room also has to double as the maintenance shed. So at any given moment, you're eating, and so, excuse me, oh, yeah, and the guy's, wheeling out a drum of oil. So it's very interesting. I didn't spend 20 bucks, and I'll tell you, you might be wondering, what would $16.50 buy you at a ski area today? Nothing. I'll tell you, I did the research, so you don't have to. You know what $16.50? You might say, well, man, it's got to buy something. So $16.50 this past season, 24-25, at Vail, Colorado, the Maine Lodge at Vail, Colorado, $16.50 would not have bought you a supersized soft drink because that was $18.28. Best day skiing I've ever had. I swear it was a gorgeous day. People are really happy to be there with their neighbors. And that's the thing. Not only did it restore, in some ways, my love for skiing, it restored my faith once again in community. Because don't forget, this is a community, this place could still be closed and all overgrown. The community decided they wanted to bring back something that was special at one time to the community, and in bringing it back, no one would be left behind. I love that. So lastly, just before we finish with triumph, I love to include this in resilience because I've always felt, not only do I think that humor plays a role in our being resilient sometimes, right? The whole idea of you got to laugh, smile, laughter's the best medicine, which I always say, yeah, that may be, but sometimes a very specific antibiotic is what's needed. But the thing is, it's also, I think, tied in with New England's DNA. There's a certain kind of wry humor that is very, very New England. It's captured best sometimes in the old Mainer jokes, like the old Mainer in the general store one morning, it's been raining all week, and the vacationing couple, asks him, they say, "Sir, do you think it's ever gonna stop raining?" And he says, "Always has." So Becky Rule, yeah, exactly, yeah. Oh, it's raining wicked hard. But Becky Rule is one of my favorite people, and she's also one of the funniest people I've met. Her humor is really, really targeted to all the stuff we're talking about. New England traditions, New England truisms, New England peculiarities especially. I love the fact that her last book, Heading for the Rhubarb, is actually a glossary of odd New England terms, mostly that aren't used anymore, and you're like, what does that mean? Like heading for the rhubarb, right? So I'm not a horse person, maybe one of you is, but I had no idea that apparently rhubarb is really, really bad for hosses, as Becky says, for hosses, right? It won't kill them, but it'll make them really sick, right? So if you, in the old days, you got a few horses, because don't forget, you'd have horses outside instead of a car in the driveway, and you would need that horse, right? And if the horses were tending down toward the rhubarb again, you better get yourself out there and get those horses back fast, right? But over time, of course, people did start to have cars in the driveway, and they didn't have horses around the backyard. But the term remained, but it didn't refer to horses anymore. The term began to take on the meaning of just anyone who's headed for trouble of any kind. So I love the example she uses in the book. She says, you might have a couple of old friends that are sitting around the front porch of the general store one morning, and it's a beautiful summer morning, and they got their feet up on the railing, and they're drinking their morning coffee, and lo and behold, they see another friend of theirs come walking up the street all jaunty, and he's arm in arm with his new lady friend. And one of the guys on the porch says to the other one, I'm going to tell you something right now. He is heading for the rhubarb with that one. Heading for the rhubarb. You want to take a shot at a New Englandism that is apparently, according to Becky, still used? You want to take a shot? Because I did not know what this one was, and the reason why I always like to see how quickly people get it, I didn't get it for a whole day and a half. In other words, the day and a half before I was coming up to Northwood to visit with Becky, and do some stories up there. I had the book. I had the page open to this word. I couldn't make it make sense. I emailed her. I said, what does this word mean? She said, say it slowly. I said, I've said it slowly. Is it a place? Adelphia? Like Philadelphia? She said, it's not a place. No. Okay, couldn't figure it out. So, got up there the next day. We went out to her backyard by the chicken coop and the little table, and I put the book down. I had a Post-it note right on that page. I opened it up. I said, use that word in a sentence, Miss Rule. She said, gladly, Mr. Reinstein. She said, I'll tell you something right now. She said, this word was used yesterday. I said, where? She said, I needed a few things. I jumped in the car. I went next door to Barrington, Caliph's General Store, and I picked up their little basket. I got a few things in my basket. I came up to the front counter, and Tina at the front counter, she says to me, all right, hon, Adelphia?
Yep.
Yep.
You get it?
That will do for you.
Yeah, exactly. That'll do for you. Exactly. Well, I hope you think you're so smart. So lastly, triumph. We'll end triumph on an up note. Two quick stories about triumph that happen to involve two of my favorite people. The first story, I'm sure you're going to think as we start out, where's the triumph here? Because if you're talking about drug abuse and you're talking about hitting bottom, just as often as not, you don't get back up. You're a statistic, and that's where Larson Ojala was headed. Larson grew up in Fitzwilliam, New Hampshire. So Fitzwilliam and Jaffrey are the two towns that are straddled by Mount Monadnock. He apparently had was like a ball of energy as a little kid. So he said one day he was driving his mother crazy after school, and she said to him, go outside and go run up and down Mount Monadnock. And he did. Now, by evening, she was starting to get worried. He said, I could hear her calling for me as I was walking back up the road. But he did it. Thinking she was serious, he did it. And then he started doing it every day after school. Literally running up and running down Mount Monadnock. Now, according to his telling, by the time he was 12 or 13, he was no longer running up Mount Monadnock after school. But he and his friends had discovered his dad's liquor cabinet. And then a year or two later, they started experimenting with drugs. By the time he was 16, he was using some pretty serious stuff like fentanyl and heroin. And by the time he was 17, almost 18, he was able to count at least two of those friends that he had begun experimenting with who were dead. And he knew that's where he was headed, because that's where you're headed. When you are at that point where you can't stop, you are no longer at all discerning about where you're buying your drugs, from who, what it might be cut with, that's where you're headed. And he knew it. What separates him into those who are statistics and those who are very lucky is that he was able to make that decision, that he simply cannot abide his life the way it is. He was doubly lucky in that he still had a family, a loving family, who had been through hell and back with him, but nonetheless was still prepared to help him. And he was triply lucky in that he had made the acquaintance of somebody who had become something of a mentor in his recovery. And this was someone who was one of those extreme hikers who runs up and down mountain peaks. And Larson was so impressed by that, he decided that was going to be the model for his recovery. That one day he was going to run up and down Mount Monadnock again. It's funny. He tells me, a bit of, really kind of gallows humor, but he said the day that he checked into the recovery center in Nashua, he said this little cell-like room, and he stuffed his duffel bag under the bed, and he said I was sitting on the end of the bed, and he said a staff person came in, and they pulled up a chair and they sat down. They said, listen, I want to ask you, do you have a model, a goal of any kind for your recovery? And he said, I do, actually. He said, my goal is to run up and down Mount Monadnock. And he said, the staff guy put the chair back, and he said, great, I'll tell you what, pal. Why don't we see if you can swing your legs out of bed and walk to breakfast in the morning, and then you'll worry about running up and down a freaking mountain, okay? But true to his goal, he met that. So this is what, 2025? So 11 years this year. 11 years, clean and sober. He married, wonderful young woman. They got 2 great little kids. They hike with the kids all over the country. He has his own concrete business today in Fitzwilliam. He talks to New Hampshire school kids. He makes it a goal at least once a week. He talks to school kids in New Hampshire about drug abuse. And in 2021, true to his goal, Larson Ojala set a world record, not one time like he did when he was a little kid, 17 summits in 24 hours, continuously running up and down Mount Monadnock. Wait for it, a year later, he broke his own record. 18 summits in 24 hours, and I knew he was doing that over the course of a Saturday night, and very early Sunday morning. So Sunday morning, when I thought he would be down, I texted him, and I said, "Congratulations, my friend. You are running free." And about an hour later, he texted me back, and he said, "Thanks, Ted." He said, "Listen, Emily and I were talking. Gonna do it again next year. She's gonna join me. Why don't you join us?" Okay, you don't have to laugh that hard. And I like to think, when I responded, I like to think I may have set my own world record for the number of consecutive laughing emojis in one 5-second burst. So very last story, which I saved for last for a reason. Not only is it an incredible triumph, but it also is one of the 3 most lovely people I've ever met in New England. They happen to be in New England. I don't mean one of the most lovely people I've met in my travels. He is one of the most lovely people I've met in life. Steve Brosnahan is a very, very special person. He is a person of uncommon gentleness. He's quiet, but he has a wonderful, wry sense of humor. He's very bright. He's very compassionate. He's very generous. He's very determined. He has a sense of grace that is really unusual to find. He is behind the city of Providence creating Goodnight Lights. Anybody ever heard of it? Anybody ever see it? Yeah. You seen it? Yeah. So it's an extraordinary thing. Goodnight Lights is amounts to an entire city, in this case Providence, saying good night every single night to the city's most vulnerable population, the young children who are fighting cancer and leukemia at Hasbro Children's Hospital. And Steve likes to joke that he's the lowest paid member of the medical staff at Hasbro Children's. When he does, I often remind him that, Steve, let's bear in mind a big part of that is the fact that you are the only member of the medical staff without a medical degree. I mean, you got to figure that in. But every member of the medical staff with degrees at Hasbro Children's will tell you that Steve Brosnahan is the only member of that medical staff that the patients are actually delighted to see. Because they know that when Steve shows up at their door without any white jacket, without a stethoscope around his neck, they know that for the next hour, there will be no pricking, no prodding, no procedures, no tests. No one will whisper something to their parents that makes them cry. They know that for the next hour, they will be transported away from everything that is making them frightened, uncertain, unsure. They know because Steve is not a doctor, he's a cartoonist. So when he arrives at the door with his buckets of crayons and markers and paints and his huge sketch pads, they know they will be transported for an hour away from all of this to a place of hope, of fun, of imagination, of creativity. In fact, I have had at least 2 different physicians at Hasbro Children's tell me the same thing, which is that they always check if they are needing to anything unpleasant that day with a patient, whether it's a procedure, whether it's unpleasant news, they always check to see if Steve has already visited, because they know they will just be in a better place to talk after Steve has been there. So about 7 or 8 years ago, Steve had become friendly with a young patient who was about to be released. So it was good, right? So he wanted to give this kid a special goodbye. They developed a wonderful little friendship, and he didn't want to just buy something. That's not really Steve. So he's trying to think of something he could do that would be special. So he's talking to the kid in his room, and he looks out the kid's window, and he realizes that the kid's window faces out the front of the hospital. And Steve rides his bike to and from work every day. So he knew that at 8:30 that night, when, by the way, it would be dark, he would be wheeling his bike right out basically under the kid's window. So he said to the kid, listen, tonight, 8:30, don't forget, 8:30 on the button. Look right out the window, right down there by that lamppost, and you're going to have a little surprise. And sure enough, at 8:30 that night, Steve wheeled his bike out. He detached his high-powered bike light. He looked up at the kid's room, and he flashed his light on and off, on and off. And then he waved, and he turned to go, and according to Steve, apparently it had rained that afternoon, right? So there were puddles all over the place. And you know how at night, when it's rained, it lights and puddles, they really reflect, right? So he's seeing a light going on and off in the puddle. So he's like, oh, I didn't turn my light. I did turn my light off. So he said, he looked up at the kid's window. The kid had just instinctively realized if he jumps up and flicks the room light on and off, he can answer Steve. And Steve said it was the biggest aha moment of his life. Because he said, I realized that if I could do that for this kid, I could do it for every kid in the hospital. And then he said he turned and he said, I looked out at the lights of the city and he thought, wait a minute, what if? And that became his ask. He went to every single business that faced the hospital in Providence. He went to every single office tower. He went to every school, Providence College, Brown. He went to every hotel, the major national chains that are down, Marriott, every single hotel. He went to every restaurant, every bar, every tavern, every coffee shop. He went to the police departments, the fire departments. He went to the barge company on the Providence River. And everybody, he made the same ask, 1 minute. That's all I'm asking, 1 minute. Turn your lights on and off for 1 minute every night. It doesn't have to cost you money. You don't have to hire anybody else. You can put it on a timer. Now, did everybody get on board right away? Of course not. That's not how it works. However, today, right? So what time do we have? Oh, it's just about 8 o'clock. In 30 minutes, could we make it to Providence from here? We could probably make it to Providence here in 30 minutes. If there was a fast bus waiting right here, we could just about make it in 30 minutes from here. If we were there at 8:30 and you didn't know what this was, you guys would know. But if you didn't know what this was, you would be like, what is going on all of a sudden? Goodnight Lights, the magic minute is going on. The magic minute is going on, which has now been copied in many other cities around the country. I always kid with Steve. Steve, if you had just trademarked this thing, that is not Steve Brosnahan. He's more than happy to share the magic minute. Today, the kids don't stay in their own rooms. The kids all go up to the solarium they created on top of the hospital with these big wraparound windows. They're all given their own flashlights so they can replicate that first kid's need to respond. They all feel like they're saying goodnight back to the city. And about 6 years ago, 7 now, I kept hearing about this story. I saw it on CBS this morning and in 60 Minutes. I was like, we got to do this story. So I called up Steve Brosnahan and I introduced myself. And I told Steve that we'd love to do this story, you know? And he said, great, we'd love to have you do it. So we were talking about it for a little while. And before I got off the phone, I said, Steve, listen, there's one other thing that has to do with doing this story. And I said, I feel really strongly about it. And I don't know if it's doable, but I said, listen, I don't want to come down and I tell this story. I don't know anything about this. And in this case, there are people who depend on this, according to you. He was telling me how there are kids who just depend on this all day. That it's there are parents who've told me it's the 1 minute, literally, of an entire day they've seen their kids smile, right? So I said, I'm not telling that story. So can you potentially connect us with a kid, with a family that might be willing? I know it's tough, you know, but we'll work with them and whatever, you know. He said, well, let me see what I can do. as far as I remember, that same afternoon, later that same afternoon, he called me back. He said, Ted, I have great news. I've got a family. They're willing to do it. Their daughter is willing to do it, and she is the perfect patient for you. Trust me. And she was. She was. Abby Waldron. Abby Waldron was the perfect patient for sure. She was 10 years old when we met Abby in April 2018. She was 2 years younger at that time than my youngest daughter, and I couldn't fathom what her parents were going through. This was relatively new. The prognosis was not clear. The diagnosis was definitely non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. She had begun immediate chemo. In less than 2 weeks, she had lost her shoulder-length hair. But here's the irony. We spent about 5.5 hours, even more into the evening, but just that day, that afternoon, and there were a lot of people around. The camera does that. People are like, oh, what the hell's going on, right? So there were lots of people around. Virtually the only person that 5.5 hours that day who did not seem at any point bored, done with this, wants to move on, getting, annoyed, never lost her smile, never stopped laughing, was the patient of all people. And about 5:30, I told Abby, I said, listen, we got to take a little break for the crew. We're going to get something to eat. And she said, you can't miss Goodnight Lights. I said, Abby, we're not missing Goodnight Lights if we have to walk back to Boston, okay? But I said, but here's the thing. I said, you're going to have a little job tonight. And I explained to her that she was going to be like our play-by-play announcer for Goodnight Lights, and it was all going to be related to us through her. I said, are you up for that? She said, yeah. And it was great. I told her, you better first save a seat right next to her, and she did. I was sitting right here. And that is the actual, as it appeared, you can see, that's a screen grab from the show that aired that April about Abby and Goodnight Lights and Steve. And 1 year later, almost to the day, eerily, 1 year later, May 2019, right? That story won an Emmy Award. And the only reason I say that is because when I got that phone call, I realized this involves other people. And this has to be shared. So Sunday morning, I called up Steve Brosnahan, and I reached Abby's family, and I said, listen, I have a surprise. I have to share something with you. Can you all meet me in front of the hospital on Monday morning at 10 o'clock? And they did, and there is Steve, and there is Abby, who is today 16 and cancer-free. That's a triumph, right? That's a triumph. Thank you. Thank you very much. Woo. Thank you. Thank you very much. Everybody's still awake. That's good. Anybody got a quick question? I always, yes.
How do you find your stories? I watch Chronicle all the time. How do you find your stories?
Oh, every way you can imagine. Seriously. Everybody has different kind of go-tos. Everybody, some people, everybody just has different ways. I mean, anything you can imagine. I mean, in this case, so this was something I was reading about. Oftentimes that happens, something has already been a print story or been even elsewhere in TV, but I know that we can treat it in a different way. And so that's something that I was reading about, right? Goodnight Lights, but sometimes, I'll see something mentioned in a magazine or read something in a book that I didn't know about. People will get in touch with me and tell me about something, they'll email, they'll call. Sometimes I love it. I even get like an old-fashioned letter or postcard. And the other way, for me, I always joke that it's a wonder that I haven't totaled more cars because for me, I just notice stuff all the time. And I don't... I feel like if I don't at that moment find out what that is, I'll forget about it, even if I write it down. So I will just, make a U-turn. I have never been afraid to just knock on someone's. I'm probably lucky I'm still alive because I have knocked on some doors in some pretty remote places where people don't get their door knocked on, and just ask somebody, what is that thing, right? Like in, I forget where that was in Maine, somewhat near Camden. But I'm driving by years ago, and it was around this time of year, so flowers were out. There was a vintage Sherman tank in this driveway, and in the place of where the gun would be in the turret, there were flowers. It was like a gigantic, planter on treads. And I was like, I knocked on the guy's door. And he was, first of all, he was like, who the hell are you? But, but then when I saw it, it ended up on Chronicle. Did you see that one? Oh, you missed that one. There you go. There you go. Anybody else? Anybody else? Anybody else? Yes?
When are you going to write the book about all the diners?
I've been asked that many times. When am I going to write a book on diners? To which I always say the same thing, which is, there are whole libraries. I'm sure I could find 6 right at the Ames about diners. There are whole libraries full of diners. I'm not sure we need a new dining book on diners. However, I always say I would be happy to make myself available to do the research on diners. I will tell you, though, in terms of writing about diners, I do have a book project in the works, and a diner figures very prominently in fiction this time. My first foray, so it could crash and burn, but we'll see. So that would be my first attempt to sort of write about diners in a different way. Anybody else? Anybody else? So listen. Thank you all very much for coming out. I really appreciate it tonight. I really appreciate the friends for having me. I do have some books with me tonight. I have the new book, but I also have some of my other books. If anybody is interested in having me sign a book for you, I would be happy to do that. You'll have to buy it first. In detail. I also have a sign-up sheet for my newsletter. So if you would like to get on my newsletter and give me your email address, I can pretty much assure you of 2 things. One, there will be no unwanted spam from me, because the odds are you'll never hear from me again. So I don't know why I say that, but that's why no one ever signs, because they say it's a waste of time. But again, thank you very much. I'll be right here. So if anybody would like a book, thank you.